Turns out 2 drinks a week, probably fine health-wise. 0 would be better.
Do I get 2 to 3 lines of cocaine per week?
The same is also true for a lot of behavioral or what are sometimes called process addictions. Things like sex addiction or video game addiction.
Just kind of challenge this idea that something like sex or food gives you a dopamine spike the same way cocaine does. Look at me. That's ridiculous. What the fuck is going on, you beautiful degenerates? It's Ashcon, aka Dropped Out Beats, back again with another Addiction Neuroscientist Reacts video. If it's your first time tuning into the channel, I appreciate having you here. I am, in fact, a trained addiction neuroscientist and a hip-hop producer. In this channel, we focus on drugs, how you can better understand them, and addiction, and how to better understand addiction. And that is why today I'm going to be reacting to Dr. Andrew Huberman, who many regard as like the god of neuroscience on the internet for some reason. It's a little unhealthy, but that's why we're going to be challenging some of his information today. Today I'm going to be reacting to a video by Dr. Huberman titled Addiction Explained, Rises and Falls in Dopamine. And my overall problem with this is that addiction cannot be explained through just dopamine, and that's exactly what we're going to be talking about. Let me throw my headphones on, make myself small, and we'll make Dr. Huberman big, and let's get into it.
Let's just think about addiction, because in biology and in psychology, frankly, it really often pays to think about the extremes first and then work our way towards more typical circumstances. And with that said, addiction, unfortunately, is very common nowadays.
It's too common?
Statistic, in fact, that there is an 80% increase in alcohol use disorder among women in the last 30 years. I talked a little bit about this in the episode that I did about alcohol and health. Again, I want to be very clear. I'm not somebody that is completely against alcohol.
I would say that increase in alcohol use disorder amongst women might have something to do with the actual definition of alcohol use disorder changing over time. Back in the day, we probably allowed, more alcohol. These days, we realize that alcohol isn't that great for you physiologically, so we've kind of reduced the number of drinks that you can have as an acceptable number. So let's hear what he has to say about that.
For adults, provided they're not alcoholics, turns out 2 drinks a week, probably fine health-wise. 0 would be better. If we're honest, 0 is better than any alcohol. But
okay, so I'm going to kind of pause him right there and push back a little bit, because I love pushing back on addiction scientists with this idea. They all seem to acknowledge that 2 drinks per week, we'll just say what Andrew says, 2 drinks per week is acceptable, but no lines of cocaine are acceptable, no smoking of methamphetamine is acceptable, no heroin, and no, all the illegal drugs, there's no amount that you can do that is acceptable, but for some reason alcohol, which is just as addictive as addictive drugs, right? Like alcohol is just another addictive drug, but for some reason you can acceptably use that. I always like to challenge that and say, do I get 2 to 3 lines of cocaine per week? But anyway, I think that really has to do with the moralization of drug use, and that all of the drugs that I use being alcohol, when I say I'm saying like Huberman, I use being alcohol is acceptable. All the drugs that you degenerates use are unacceptable, and you're not allowed to use any of them. And so I also know that Huberman is not he's not formally trained in any sort of addiction science, because he uses the term like alcoholic, alcoholism. When you are trained in addiction science, they explicitly say how bad these words are due to the stigmatization of people. I talked a lot about this in my Finn McKenty video. Please go watch it. I'll drop the link right here. With that being said, let's get back to the video.
But 2 drinks a week is probably fine. Past 2 drinks, you start running into problems.
2 lines of coke.
And yet many, many people out there, male and female alike, suffer from alcohol use disorder, also called alcoholism. The same is also true for things like methamphetamine or cocaine or other types of substance addictions. And the same is also true for a lot of behavioral or what are sometimes called process addictions. things like sex addiction or video game addiction, or any type of behavior that frankly is leveraging the dopamine system, but that engages this progressive narrowing of the things that bring someone pleasure, such that nothing else is really salient. Nothing else is really pulling them in the way that their video games or sex or pornography or alcohol, pick your substance or, behavior that you see out there, or hopefully not, but that you might suffer from an addiction to.
So I think Huberman gets dopamine spikes from touching his mic, because he does that shit way too much. But let me make myself big again and just kind of challenge this idea that something like sex or food gives you a dopamine spike the same way cocaine does. Look at me. That's ridiculous. Okay, now we know that is absolutely ridiculous, because here is some science that we're going to read and is cited down in the description below. Chiara and Bassareo. Hopefully I pronounced that something like correctly. If I butcher your name, I don't feel bad, because my name was butchered for my whole life. So it's all good. So they're going to explain to you how cocaine and something like food or sex is not the same, or doesn't activate pleasure in the same way. So this reads: addictive drugs share with palatable food the property of increasing extracellular dopamine, preferentially in the nucleus accumbens shell rather than in the core. However, by acting directly on the brain, drugs bypass the adaptive mechanisms habituation that constrain the responsiveness of accumbens shell dopamine to food reward. That is absolutely critical to understand, because what it is saying is that food, you eat, you digest, it goes through a whole process to get into your bloodstream, and maybe the taste activates some dopamine, but it is not the same thing as when you snort a line of coke, or you smoke coke, or you do a line of heroin. That directly gets into your bloodstream, goes into your brain, and activates those dopamine cells, along with the opioid system, which is absolutely critical to understand for addiction. And so that's one of the ways I know that Dr. Huberman doesn't fully understand addiction.
So what's happening in addiction? Well, addiction involves dopamine, among other things, often the opioid system, etc.
The opioid system is absolutely critical, and to only use a model of cocaine use disorder and dopamine as a means of explaining addiction is a little dishonest, in my opinion, because what is the number one drug that we are struggling with in terms of poisonings in this country? Fentanyl, which is an opioid, which directly acts on the opioid system.
But if we were to think about what's the stimulus in an addiction, and what's the peak in dopamine, and then what happens after that peak, it all becomes very clear as to why addiction happens and why it's so pernicious. So for instance, let's take cocaine. Cocaine causes dramatic increases in dopamine very, very fast. So if somebody craves cocaine, what are they craving? They're craving that dopamine peak.
They're not just craving that dopamine peak, and to simplify it to that is ridiculous. They are craving cocaine.
Increased level of alertness. They're craving a number of things associated with the feeling of being under the influence of the drug, but the stimulus for it simply becomes that line of cocaine, or in the case of crack, that crack rock that they're going to smoke. And God forbid they're mainlining.
Look at the mic touching
it. They're shooting into a vein.
He's mainlining that mic dopamine straight to his veins.
What happens is they snort, smoke, or inject cocaine, and dopamine levels almost immediately go up to a very high peak. Okay, so
his science here isn't totally wrong. Okay, like this is some basic science that is, kind of right for the most part.
Time gap between the stimulus and the dopamine is very, very short. So short, in fact, that there's really no other contingencies in between that the mesocortical system has to learn. In fact, what does the system, quote unquote, learn? It learns cocaine equals massive amounts of dopamine equals feeling euphoric and energetic, etc. And in doing that, it reinforces the whole circuit so that short, we can even say hyper short contingency is really what the system wants. So much so that longer contingencies of, say, putting in the hard work of, generating a fitness program or a professional program for yourself or a education program, which takes not just many days, but many weeks and years. Well, none of that is going to lead to peaks in dopamine that are as high as the peak in dopamine associated with cocaine.
I don't know why you would compare something that is more of a longevity activity to doing cocaine. That is a disingenuous comparison because doing cocaine might be more like going for a run on a day like that. Doing cocaine makes you feel good. Going for a run makes you feel good. And so someone who has done a lot of cocaine can still feel good from going for a run. They seek cocaine for a specific reason that is not just addressed by dopamine. It is addressed by the fact that they most likely have trauma that is unaddressed, that is then or makes them feel a lot of pain, that is associated with a lot of pain. So cocaine helps address this problem holistically. The motivation comes from, or the lack of motivation would come from a feeling of pain that we can help with cocaine. It's not just that, cocaine is so rewarding that you become a degenerate. No, imagine if you're doing cocaine and making a fitness plan. Man, you're going to make a great fitness plan and you're going to think it's the best fitness plan you ever made and you're going to think that you're going to do it because you high on some coke. But so those two things could then synergize to boost your dopamine even more is what I'm saying. And so to compare, a longevity activity like working out and feeling your body get stronger to one night of cocaine is ridiculous. That doesn't help us understand addiction in this country any better.
So that tells us something critical.
It probably doesn't.
Both the duration between desire and effect. And when I say effect, I mean the rewarding properties of dopamine that are experienced. That's important. So very short gaps teach the system to expect and want short gaps. Makes it very hard to pursue things that take longer. So
there is some research out of Virginia Tech as to what he's talking about, and maybe I'll make a video on that down the road, but he's so oversimplifying the problem here that I can't give him that credit.
We say it's the short, or in this case, hyper short distance or time between the stimulus and the dopamine. What we're really talking about, if we were to plot this out on a board or on a piece of paper, is the steepness of the rise of that peak. It's very, very steep. The peak in dopamine is coming up very fast after the desire.
Notice he's touching his mic as he says that.
And in addition to that, and this is very important, the higher the peak in dopamine and the faster the rise to that peak, the further below baseline the dopamine drops after the drug wears off. Okay, so in the case of cocaine, it's a very fast and very large rise in dopamine, followed by a steep drop and very deep trough in dopamine below baseline. You say, okay, so there's pleasure, then there's lack of pleasure. But it's worse than that because it's not just lack of pleasure. If you recall what we talked about a little bit earlier, that drop below baseline triggers the desire and the pursuit for what? For more. And so this sets in motion a vicious loop where people start pursuing peaks in dopamine that can come very fast without much effort. And that's one of the ways in which addictions start to take hold. Now, there's a simple way to think about this and to remember if you want to avoid this whole thing. I mean, the first one is obvious. Don't do cocaine. Don't try it. Don't use it. Certainly don't get addicted to it.
It's not that simple, my guy.
Those are all sort of one and the same, frankly. I don't know many people that, despite opinions to the contrary, that use cocaine recreationally, that don't at some point run into either a financial, psychological, physical, or some other problem. The other thing that
Why is it that other people are allowed, or why is it that everyone is able to use alcohol and that not have those issues then? We're lying to ourselves about illegal drugs. I don't think that not everyone who uses cocaine has that experience. Not everyone who uses cocaine gets addicted to cocaine for this dopamine bullshit. And so, yeah, it's kind of ridiculous.
it's absolutely critical to keep in mind, and this was discussed in my colleague, Dr. Anna Lemke's book, Dopamine Nation, and on this podcast. Excellent book, by the way. I highly recommend it if you haven't read it already. It's a fascinating exploration into dopamine as it relates to addiction.
I'm probably going to buy that book, read it, and give a reaction to you that's going to roast it. So let me know in the comments if you'd like to hear it.
Not just drug addiction, but other types of addiction. Again, the name of that book is Dopamine Nation. We'll provide a link to it in the show note captions. The other thing that happens after those big, fast increases in dopamine caused by things like cocaine is afterwards, when it quickly drops below baseline, it takes a much longer time to get back to the original baseline than it did prior to using the drug.
AKA, you're just a disgusting degenerate.
And worse still is that the peaks in dopamine that are created from more consumption of cocaine leads to progressively lower peaks and deeper troughs below baseline. So the whole system is shifting away from pleasure and more to pain and the desire for pursuit of the drug.
Okay, so thank God that's over. I don't exactly know what he's talking about there, that the system shifts towards pain. But let me read you guys this little blurb from one of my favorite scientists, David Nutt, who is always a skeptic of, kind of drugs are bad for you. You're a degenerate if you use them, talking point. And so this isn't going to let me make this any bigger. For several decades, addiction has come to be viewed as a disorder of the dopamine neurotransmitter system. However, this view has not led to new treatments. In this opinion article, we review the origins of the dopamine theory of addiction and discuss the ability of addictive drugs to elicit the release of dopamine in the human striatum. There is robust evidence that stimulants increase striatal dopamine levels, and some evidence that alcohol may have such an effect, but little evidence, if any, that cannabis and opiates increase dopamine levels. Moreover, there is good evidence that striatal dopamine receptor availability and dopamine release are diminished in individuals with stimulant or alcohol dependence, but not in individuals with opiate, nicotine, or cannabis dependence. These observations have implications for understanding reward and treatment responses in various addictions, and pretty clearly tells us that Dr. Andrew Huberman does not understand addiction. And so the last point that I want to make is that, he was ending on this whole, as you use cocaine more and more, your dopamine system, when you're not on cocaine, has a lower baseline. And there is some evidence of that, but the problem is that him and all the dopamine crazed people think that this means that you can't experience pleasure after having a cocaine use disorder. And so I just want to let you know, if you have a cocaine use disorder, that didn't break your brain. You will still be able to feel pleasure from things like sex. If you skateboarding, if you train jujitsu, whatever you do, paint, whatever you do, music, you know what I mean? Like, you're still going to feel pleasure from these things. The idea that your dopamine system is broken and you're never going to feel pleasure again is absolutely ridiculous. And that's kind of the narrative that Dr. Huberman provides. It's the narrative that he supports for the most part. And I just think he doesn't understand addiction. So with that being said, in the comments below, if you agree, disagree with me, think I'm an idiot, I appreciate you being here. Subscribe to the channel. Hit the like if you like this video. I appreciate all you beautiful degenerates. You're called beautiful degenerates because, we all like to get into a little bit of degeneracy, but that doesn't make us bad people, you feel me? Peace out.
Learn together and experience together how to reach the 5 levels of consciousness which are available to a species like
found.